Turkish March, Road to Boston, The Harriet.
The New American Revolution. Common Sense Reinstated. The movie.
Да здравствует мир между народами. Долой поджигателей войны.
Москва. Красная площадь. Тысячи людей приходят почтить память гениального вождя рабочего класса, основателя коммунистической партии и советского государства Владимира Ильича Ленина и великого продолжателя его дела Иосифа Виссарионовича Сталина, отдавших всю свою жизнь борьбе за счастье трудящихся.
On the morning of February the 25th, 1956, First Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, delivered a report on Stalin's personality cult and its consequences to a closed session of the 20th Party Congress. Only 3 years had passed since the death of the dear and beloved leader, and suddenly he was being accused of such monstrous crimes against his own people that the public later found it hard to believe. Stalin's body was taken out of the mausoleum. It did not lay alongside Lenin's. His remains were eventually buried near the Kremlin wall. In 1918, Vladimir Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, had every reason to say that we have won Russia over and we must now govern Russia. Lenin's notes, letters and telegrams show his administrative style. You must display exemplary ruthlessness, execute by firing squad without asking anyone and without permitting idiotic red tape. Although Lenin died in 1924, his ultra-talented comrades in arms continued to strengthen the totalitarian regime he had founded. Joseph Stalin became the USSR's leader virtually Virtually overnight, after ousting his main rival, Leon Trotsky, Stalin began to methodically and purposefully eliminate the so-called Lenin Guard. Stalin also had his own approach to dealing with ordinary people. The property of well-to-do peasants, known as kulaks, was expropriated, and entire peasant families were exiled to remote areas of the country. Poor peasants were forced to join the collective farms. The rapid pace of industrialization required genuinely forced and backbreaking labor. This caused discontent and civil unrest, which often escalated into the most violent forms of protest. Rioters and insurgents were either executed by firing squad or at best exiled or sent to prison camps. A search for the enemies of the people among technocrats, creative intellectuals, high-ranking local council officials, as well as civil servants and Communist Party functionaries led to unprecedented mass repression. As a rule, political cases were tried without prosecutors or defense attorneys. Death sentences were carried out immediately. The Great Purge climaxed in 1937-38, when many top Red Army commanders were either executed or imprisoned. Stalin feared everyone. Everyone feared Stalin. Only a small group of Stalin's supporters managed to survive during the 30-year rule of the great leader and teacher. And all of them were also responsible for committing bloody crimes against their compatriots. They say that the death of one person is a tragedy, but the death of millions is just a statistic. But all these millions are survived by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and each of them recalls his or her own tragedy.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote.
Those who gave us nuclear weapons.
Designed to neutralize an enemy nuclear missile.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Garrett Utley, NBC News, Moscow.
Good evening. President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev began 5 days of summit meetings here in Moscow with ceremonial greetings and private talks about human rights. While the two leaders were meeting, Raisa Gorbachev took Nancy Reagan on a tour of the Kremlin grounds. After that, President and Mrs. Reagan took a stroll in a Moscow shopping district. They were so mobbed by well-wishers and security agents and news people, they had to be rushed back to their limousine. There will be a second summit meeting at the Kremlin tomorrow and also a state dinner.
The year was 1988 and Mikhail Gorbachev had proclaimed in a speech to the United Nations that the Soviet Union would no longer interfere in the political and economic affairs of the Soviet satellite states, such as Poland and East Germany, signifying the conclusion to the Soviet experiment in the Cold War. 3 years later, when the USSR finally collapsed and the neoliberal world order appeared poised to seamlessly dominate the global system until the end of time, American political scientist Francis Fukuyama considered the end of history the bloodiest century that the face of the planet had ever witnessed was nearing to a close. The ideological defeat of classical fascism and communism left only liberalism to dominate the world, Fukuyama himself noting that the Chinese Communist Party's rapid economic growth was due to a liberalization of economic and trade policy, and currently China is only communist in name. After the failure to remove Saddam Hussein in the Persian Gulf War and a one-term President George H.W. Bush, the Clinton era began and wavered on some of the last remaining policies of FDR's New Deal, including the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which protected the economy from reckless banking based on speculation, and generally capitulated to conservatives, especially on issues concerning domestic crime, particularly targeting black Americans, which helped to fuel the prison industrial complex and expand racial tension. Despite this, the American people viewed Bill Clinton favorably and America was not involved in any major international conflicts. The economic policies instituted by the federal government in the 1980s enabled corporations and extremely wealthy individuals to essentially govern America and enormously widen the economic gap between the rich and the middle class, and this was evident for all with eyes or ears as far back as when Bill Clinton was preparing to run for president in 1991. He correctly discerned the problem in a declaration stating, "The Reagan-Bush years have exalted private gain over public obligation, special interests over the common good. The 1980s ushered in a gilded age of greed and selfishness, of irresponsibility and excess, and of neglect." Remember, Bill Clinton was the last president in history to unseat an incumbent. This is still yet one of the greatest domestic issues. However, after the Clinton debacle concerning NAFTA, and the what would now appear rather unremarkable Monica Lewinsky scandal, the GOP have seemingly recovered ground and have been pushing further towards the deep end ever since with blatantly anti-consumer policies, the abolition of environmental protection efforts, support of Christian fundamentalism, and the further touting of a thoroughly debunked and utter failure of the so-called trickle-down theory of economics.
American 11, are you trying to call?
The cockpit is not answering their phone. Our number 1 has been staffed and our 5 has been staffed.
I am going to call from Washington. I am in a situation with American 11, a possible hijack.
What's going on, Betty? The crap is erratic again. Problems very erratic.
Good morning, America. I'm Charles Gibson.
I'm Diane Sawyer, and it's Tuesday, September 11th, 2001.
It is lunchtime in London, 5 a.m. in Los Angeles, and 8 a.m. here in New York, live from the CNN Financial News headquarters.
It is beautiful outside, perfect September day with lots of sunshine. Oh, would you look at Washington, huh? I'm going outside today.
Other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet.
Number 2.
Yeah. This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center.
A la espera de mayores informaciones, saber qué fue lo que ocurrió, cómo fue que
After the United States was hideously attacked by religious fascists on September 11th, a new, less coherent enemy to liberal democracy appeared, described by the government, and endlessly picked up by the media, as the war against terrorism. The Oxford definition of terrorism is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. The key word is, of course, unlawful, as the state cannot commit actions that are considered against their own law. However, even leading member states of the United Nations do not have an agreed-upon definition for the term, which makes implementing effective counterterrorism measures that much more difficult. The 9/11 hijackers certainly were terrorists, but they were not murderous psychopaths. They were highly motivated individuals captivated by what they perceived as the one true faith and likely brainwashed by some combination of sincerely Islamic thinkers as well as cynical opportunists that would never martyr themselves. In response, the Bush administration enacted a calamitous war effort in Iraq, which many argue was actually in violation of international law, the best of which could be said about is that at least Saddam was disposed. However, as Senator Bernie Sanders stated in 2003, the removal of the Ba'athist regime will result in various and potentially extremely destructive unintended consequences.
Gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from New Jersey for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I don't think any member of this body disagrees that Saddam Hussein is a tyrant, a murderer, and a man who has started 2 wars. He is clearly someone who cannot be trusted or believed. The question, Mr. Speaker, is not whether we like Saddam Hussein or not. The question is whether he represents an imminent threat to the American people and whether a unilateral American invasion of Iraq will do more harm than good. Mr. Speaker, the front page of the Washington Post today reported that all relevant U.S. intelligence agencies now say, despite what we have heard from the White House, that, quote, Saddam Hussein is unlikely to initiate a chemical or biological attack against the United States, end quote. Even more importantly, our intelligence agencies say that should Saddam conclude that a U.S.-led attack could no longer be deterred, he might, at that point, launch a chemical or biological counterattack. In other words, there is more danger of an attack on the United States if we launch a precipitous invasion. Mr. Speaker, I do not know why the President feels, despite what our intelligence agencies are saying, that it is so important to pass a resolution of this magnitude this week, and why it is necessary to go forward without the support of the United Nations and our major allies, including those who are fighting side by side with us in the war on terrorism. But I do feel that as a part of this process, the President is ignoring some of the most pressing economic issues affecting the well-being of ordinary Americans. There has been virtually no public discussion about the stock market's loss of trillions of dollars over the last few years, and that millions of Americans have seen the retirement benefits for which they have worked their entire lives disappear. When are we going to address that issue? This country today has a $340 billion trade deficit, and we have lost 10% of our manufacturing jobs in the last 4 years, 2 million decent-paying jobs. The average American worker today is working longer hours for lower wages than 25 years ago. When are we going to address that issue? Mr. Speaker, poverty in this country is increasing, and median family income is declining. Throughout this country, family farmers are being driven off of the land, and veterans, the people who have put their lives on the line to defend us, are unable to get the health care and other benefits they were promised because of government underfunding. When are we going to tackle these issues and many other important issues that are of such deep concern to Americans? Mr. Speaker, in the brief time I have, let me give you 5 reasons why I'm opposed to giving the President a blank check to launch a unilateral invasion and occupation of Iraq, and why I will vote against this resolution. 1, I have not heard any estimates of how many young American men and women might die in such a war, or how many tens of thousands of women and children in Iraq might also be killed. As a caring nation, we should do everything we can to prevent the horrible suffering that a war will cause. War must be the last recourse in international relations, not the first. Second, I am deeply concerned about the precedent that a unilateral invasion of Iraq could establish in terms of international law and the role of the United Nations. If President Bush believes that the U.S. can go to war at any time against any nation, what moral or legal obligation could our government raise if another country chose to do the same thing? Third, the United States is now involved in a very difficult war against international terrorism, as we learned tragically on September 11th. We are opposed by Osama bin Laden and religious fanatics who are prepared to engage in a kind of warfare that we have never experienced before. I agree with Brent Scowcroft, Republican former National Security Advisor for President George Bush Sr., who stated, and I quote, "An attack on Iraq at this time would seriously jeopardize, if not destroy, the global counter-terrorist campaign we have undertaken," end quote. Fourth, at a time when this country has a $6 trillion national debt and a growing deficit, we should be clear that a war and a long-term American occupation of Iraq could be extremely expensive. Fifth, I am concerned about the problems of so-called unintended consequences. Who will govern Iraq when Saddam Hussein is removed? And what role will the U.S. play in an ensuing civil war that could develop in that country? Will moderate governments in the region who have large Islamic fundamentalist populations be overthrown and replaced by extremists? Will the bloody conflict between Israel and the Palestinian Authority be exacerbated? And these are just a few of the questions that remain unanswered.
And the Pentagon is being evacuated.
In addition, the unelected and unaccountable national security apparatus was given nearly free rein to infringe upon virtually all constitutional rights of any person, U.S. citizen or not, essentially suspending habeas corpus. Not to mention, the systematic deregulation of banks and Wall Street eventually led to the 2008 financial crisis, in which nearly $1 trillion of stock market value was wiped out, and further validated the spuriously established precedent that corporatism is the best way for the U.S. to function. Although the historical course of human civilization does appear rather Hegelian, not only did the human species arrive nowhere near the end of history, these are indeed distinguished times. Perhaps the underlying problem in America is the intense corporate exploitation of the government, the environment, and individual laborers, combined with deliberate attacks on democracy through lobbying and other anti-democratic practices, such as well-financed misinformation campaigns, which has resulted in the utter stagnation of average wages across the country that has since fell below the line of inflation, also culminating monumental wealth inequality. For decades, American corporations have had disastrous effects in communities across the entire globe, which is causing extreme economic disparity between social classes, often resulting in total destitution and utter annihilation. Currently, the status quo demands that profits must continue at literally all external costs, which naturally means once artificial intelligence is implemented in the macroeconomy, the wealth gap will become so immense that the world will plummet into a dystopia. Yet with so many obfuscations and divisive political conflicts that are predominantly predicated on what is known as so-called cultural issues, it becomes increasingly more difficult to properly assign responsibility for any given social malady or even discern the problems. In addition to such civilizational disorder, America is plagued by homicidal terrorism that is disproportionately being carried out by individuals brandishing legally purchased firearms who also identify as right-wing and sympathize with the current president. However ineffectual the Obama administration ultimately turned out to be, considering he often capitulated to private power and launched one of the most comprehensive imperial war efforts in Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, with the drone strike program killing nearly 1,000 civilians in his first year alone as president, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Since President Obama was forced to stand down due to term limits, which the current president suggested maybe America should abolish as the chairman of China has done, the political division has been massively exacerbated and it is having calamitous effects on America. Indeed, as the iconoclast, Christopher Hitchens, used to regularly state, politics is division by definition, but this particular moment in American history appears to present a political gap so wide it has not been since the tumultuous decade of the 1960s, amidst racial segregation, the assassinations of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the existential conflict with the Soviet Union, and the imperialist war in Vietnam to extend French colonialism, that the political climate has been so volatile and the discourse so inflammatory. This was true before the global pandemic and the protests and riots over the murder of George Floyd. The severe polarization is disintegrating American political discourse and has opened the door for sheer demagoguery and the normalization of openly racist and bigoted sentiment, as well as an overstimulated propensity to label anyone with seemingly conservative views as either a racist, sexist, bigot, or a so-called Islamophobe, many of which actually do not have any legitimate right-wing political ties at all, or at the very least, do not support the extremist, incoherently constructed far-right ideology that the president is perpetuating. At this point in time, it wouldn't be a stretch to simply apply the Russian model of interpreting official statements made by the federal government, in which what they outright and blatantly deny is literally and explicitly the exact line that they are privately embracing.
We are having some technical difficulties, which is totally understandable when you try to do ad hoc reporting and getting information to you as fast as we possibly can and making sure that it's accurate at the same time. So
Donald Trump is on the line. Now, we know him as the man behind lots of real estate in Manhattan, and of course, Donald, I understand you were actually a witness to what happened this morning.
Well, I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw this huge explosion. I was with a group of people, and I really couldn't even believe it. And even, I think, worse than that, for years I've looked right directly at the building. I'd see the Empire State Building in the foreground and the World Trade Center in the background. And now I'm looking at absolutely nothing. It's just gone. And it's just hard to believe.
Donald, Alan Marcus here. Your building is, the Trump Tower, is one of the great tourist attractions in the world. It's well known universally. Are you taking any precautions there in light of what happened at the World Trade Center?
Well, Alan, we've always had, as you know, very, very strong security, but there's very little you can do about planes crashing into a building. If you look at Larry Silverstein, who's a terrific owner in New York and a very good friend of mine who I just called. I was very worried about him because I assumed maybe he was in the building. He took possession of the building 1 week ago. As you know, he just bought the World Trade Center.
Right.
And he was in his office, and he was getting ready to move into the World Trade Center over the next 2 weeks. So when I just spoke to him, there's nothing you can do when people are going to be bombing planes at your building. Now, I guess maybe the world is going to be changing, and maybe you're going to have F-16s flying all over the city, etc. But it's a pretty tough situation.
Donald, you have one of the landmark buildings down in the financial district, 40 Wall Street. Did you have any damage, or did you know what's happened down there?
Well, it was an amazing phone call I made. 40 Wall Street actually was the second tallest building in downtown Manhattan, and it was actually, before the World Trade Center, was the tallest. And then when they built the World Trade Center, it became known as the second tallest, and now it's the tallest.
And now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
There are demonstrations in major American cities across the country tonight over the election of Donald Trump as president. Protesters gather in Philadelphia, Seattle, Boston, Portland, Oakland, California, Chicago, and New York tonight. The protest in New York has made its way to Trump Tower, where a large crowd has gathered. Jean Kazara is there. She joins us now.
They're really stopped now because we started with them at Union Square and we've walked up Fifth Avenue, mainly 40 blocks is how far we've marched with them up to here. And these people are protesting, of course, the election of Donald Trump. Stop. You can hear them. Let's listen for a second.
The Hong Kong side, the police were still chasing the protesters. The officers jumping out of vans to tackle whoever they could catch. In some cases,
Donald Trump.
Oh, please. Well, he's managed to cover 90% of his head with 30% of his hair. So that's an achievement.
The new American Revolution is not a revolution without a revolution. For England, the initial acquisition of land was nothing more than acts of savagery against neighboring sectarian tribes, in which William the Conqueror was seen as victorious and established as the first king of England in 1066 and remained in power until he died 21 years later. Monarchical rule is confirmed by so-called divine right, naturally granted by the Christian God. For nearly 700 years the territory of the United Kingdom was enabling the most brutal, torturous forms of government on the face of the planet, with explicit mandates from the New Testament and ecclesiastical dogma. The oppression and persecution of many religious minorities and political dissenters forced some early congregational leaders to flee England for Holland and eventually establish the second ever permanent settlement in the new lands of America in 1620, called Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts. The first, of course, being Jamestown, Virginia, which was a purely imperial effort managed by the Virginia Company of London, commissioned by King James I. Jamestown played a major role in the establishment of formal slavery in British North America, with many historians citing an indentured servant known as John Punch as the first official slave in the American colonies after he was sentenced to live the rest of his life in servitude for attempting to escape to Maryland. 2 Europeans who also attempted to escape were sentenced less harshly, which served as the first legal distinction between Europeans and Africans.
And let's also say that both were treated real bad. To be an indentured servant in this country meant that you literally didn't have any rights.
Which is naturally fundamentally opposed to the values expounded in the Constitution that would be drafted over a century later. Remarkably, genetic genealogy testing done by the Ancestry.com company has indicated that John Punch may be the 12th generation grandfather to Barack Obama on his mother's side, and also even considered to be a paternal ancestor to the American political scientist, Ralph Bunche, who, in 1950, was the first black American to win the Nobel Peace Prize for his mediation efforts in Israel. America has a very dark history. The territory of the United States is essentially founded on genocide and usurpation. It is indeed true that the first pilgrims to America were pious Christian settlers, which explains why American colonists so readily massacred the indigenous populations of North and South America, as they were seen as evil pagans worshipping false idols. In addition, the brutal enslavement of Africans was the basis of the economy in the God-fearing southern states for many decades. After the Union's victory in the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States, but the Jim Crow laws enforced the legal separation of blacks and whites for another century in the South. Virtually all slaveholders and supporters of Jim Crow were devout Christians, and naturally, not only did the Bible enforce their bigotry and cruelty, but it also morally justified it as well. Remember, the Divine Father of Christ was quite fond of the enslavement of entire populations, if he was feeling generous. In essence, the practice of slavery is the quintessential manifestation of laissez-faire capitalism, and slave ships on expeditions to conduct mass murder, rape, large-scale theft, and kidnapping often sailed under the blessing of the church. Currently in the media, there is a huge focus on racial inequality and other race-related issues, especially concerning police brutality. Although in terms of pure statistical data, more whites are killed by the police than blacks, Simpson's paradox shows that, even if though the overall deaths per police encounter are lower for blacks, because blacks encounter police much more frequently and are more likely to face charges or aggression for non-crimes, traffic offenses, misdemeanors, etc. The evidence still indicates that police are more likely to use deadly force when it is not appropriate against black people rather than white people. All supplementary evidence does indeed indicate that there is a systemic racial bias against blacks overall in the criminal justice apparatus. However, what is often ignored by most liberals when speaking on this issue is that what is generally ascribed to generic racism is often a result of historic racism that has now evolved into severe class discrepancies that have predominantly affected the black community. Although racism is still a problem, the real menace to society is poverty, but for virtue-signaling corporations, who often take part in brutal economic oppression themselves, it is extremely convenient to ignore those types of inequalities and superficially focus on race. Many prominent Democrats perpetuate this kind of thought process, and in order to stabilize and improve American society, there needs to be a fundamental overhaul of the only viable nominally left-wing party in the U.S.
Committee. Hey, I want to bring up something that Jonathan last put in the Bulwark today, and it was about how, in Ruth, we've all been on the receiving end of the Bernie online brigade, and here's what he says. He says, no other candidate has anything like this sort of digital brown shirt brigade. I mean, except for Donald Trump. The question no one is asking is this: what if you can't win the presidency without an online mob? What if we now live in a world where having a bullying agro-social media army running around, popping anyone who sticks their head up is either an important ingredient for or a critical marker of success?
Wow. Okay.
What is going on here, and is this any way to pick a nominee?
I was reading last night, Brian, I know you're a history guy too. I'm reading last night about the fall of France in the summer of 1940. And the general, Renault, calls up Churchill and says, it's over. And Churchill said, how can it be? You got the greatest army in Europe. How can it be over? He said, it's over. So I had that suppressed feeling. I can't be as wild as Carville, but he is damn smart. And I think he's damn right on this one. Joy. Let me start with my headline tonight. I'm retiring.
The Kurdish people in Iraq are truly revolutionarily minded people that fought on the ground in North Africa against the Islamic fascists. They are a people without a state that are often abandoned by America and oppressed by Turkey, yet they are directly responsible for the formal defeat of ISIS and must be integrated into the global economy and would likely be open to various forms of capitalist assimilation.
The Turkish government, the presence of a Kurdish government on the other side of its border with Syria has been seen as unacceptable. The YPG and the SDF are made up of a Kurdish militia known as the PKK, which the Turkish government basically considers to be a terrorist organization. The Kurdish forces have launched several campaigns over the last several decades to foster an independent homeland, to fight for self-determination in the region, which has led to the Turkish government outlawing these kinds of organizations. And so this idea that a Kurdish militia could control vast swaths of land so close to the Turkish border has basically been a non-starter for the Turkish regime.
If it were not for the small contingency of U.S. troops remaining in northern Syria, it is quite probable that the Kurds in that region would face genocide from one opposition or another. However, while this film was being made, the American president actually withdrew the U.S. troops that were stationed in northeastern Syria, while simultaneously deploying troops to assist Saudi Arabia wage an illegal war in Yemen that is causing massive human rights violations according to the UN. The U.S. government not only betrayed the Kurdish people yet again, but have also totally capitulated to Turkish forces, which immediately began oppressing the Kurds in the region.
A war monitor says fighting has resumed between Kurdish fighters and Turkish-backed rebels in the northern Syrian province of Raqqa. About a total of 30 fighters from both sides were killed on Wednesday during battles near the safe zones Turkey proposed to create to ensure its border security.
Some reports which have surfaced stated some absolutely shocking material regarding Jared Kushner allegedly greenlighting the arrest of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi before he was premeditatedly murdered and dismembered, although no substantial evidence has been brought forth to corroborate that claim. But it is certainly not inconceivable.
Jared Kushner on the sidelines today, but making a rare move into the spotlight overnight on Fox News, sidestepping a question about the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
I think our intelligence agencies are making their assessments, and we're hoping to make sure that there's justice brought where that should be.
No mention by Kushner of the Saudi crown prince, even though the CIA has already concluded he ordered the murder. With new questions now about Kushner's close relationship with Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who has denied involvement.
However, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire fiasco is that large numbers of ISIS prisoners who were being detained under Kurdish supervision have essentially been given freedom to reassemble and organize future operations in the region.
$533 million, $525 million, that's peanuts for you. Should have increased it. $880 million, $645 million, $6 billion, that's for frigates. 889 million, 63 million, and that's for various artillery.
Yemen's 4-year-long war has never been a simple two-sided conflict, but rather a messy patchwork of stakeholders locked in regional and international power struggles, often based on historical, religious, and geographical divisions. In March 2015, when President Hadi was forced to flee the country, Saudi Arabia scrambled to form a mainly Sunni Arab coalition to salvage his government, an alliance which received support from France, the UK and the US. Today, the coalition controls large swathes of the country. But a major crack in that coalition has now emerged. The already troubled alliance, forged between UAE-backed separatists in the south and forces loyal to President Hadi, has been shaken by recent fighting in the government bastion of Aden. In 2018, the 26-member secessionist organisation, Southern Transitional Council, had already accused the government of corruption and called for the removal of the Prime Minister.
Is Hamas a terrorist group?
Definitely not. And I can tell you why. First of all, let me just quickly tell you who I am and where I'm from.
Yeah.
I'm Tunisian, originally from Tunisia. I'm a British, originally from Tunisia. And
Most American imperial efforts in the region are easy to condemn, and there is certainly a fear of infidel boots on holy lands, which allows for a deadly combination of forces. The pious mujahideen were preferable over the atheist communists. However, such alliances did little to discourage bin Laden and what would become al-Qaeda from attacking the evil capitalist empire. Osama bin Laden was a very wealthy Saudi Arabian citizen, and he gained immense influence over the Sunni world. He studied at university, received a degree in civil engineering, and even attended an elite secular school for 2 years before that. He saw that America was indeed ruled by the almighty dollar rather than almighty Allah. In his mind, it had to be destroyed. One of the problems with the apologists is that they will not admit any link between Islamic doctrine and Islamic terrorism because it opposes their narrative that the United States government and Israel is responsible for all of the violence in the Middle East. It's peanuts to condemn the inhumane occupation of the Palestinian people. But it is clear that the issue with Israel and Palestine is that both sides are claiming supernatural real estate rights that can never be settled without a theological grievance. These are essentially two forms of fascism, one dressed up as orthodox religious nationalism and the other as militant jihadism. Of course, the United States does not make matters any better, with practically blind support for Israel and its right-wing government on account of the religious theocrats and warmongers in the US government. Considering that it is the Israelis in power, the left wing tends to correspondingly blindly support Palestine and justify the terrorism. Clearly, the occupation is not merely based on religious differences, and there are obviously legitimate political aspects to this issue, but there seems to be a kind of confusion of what the difference between politics and religion really is. Israel continuing to annex parts of the West Bank is clearly a terrestrial grievance imposed on the Palestinians. Nevertheless, if the reaction is to retaliate with suicidal terrorism on a large scale, there are clearly heavy supernatural influences and expected implications in accordance with these actions. Since 1989, there has been approximately 800 people killed by Palestinian suicide bombers, which Hamas often claims responsibility for.
America on hand to dedicate the building. The president spoke in a video message.
Today we officially open the United States Embassy in Jerusalem. Congratulations. It's been a long time coming.
Trump's point man on Middle East peace, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, told the crowd that the president is a man who follows through on his promises.
We have shown the world once again that the United States can be trusted. We stand with our friends and our allies.
Israelis and Americans gathered near the embassy to celebrate.
It's the right thing to do. It may not be the popular thing to do with liberal leftists, but it's the right thing to do.
Well, most Israelis support Trump's decision to move the embassy. A small but vocal minority came out to back the Palestinians. Angry confrontations here in Jerusalem as well. Israelis left versus right. You don't need to speak Hebrew to understand the anger. Not long after this pro-Palestinian demonstration began, the police decided enough was enough, seizing Palestinian flags and banners, detaining a handful of protesters.
They are afraid of the Palestinian flag, which is a symbol of a nation struggling in order to be free.
Anger over the relocation of the U.S. Embassy is expected to spill into tomorrow, a day when Palestinians will once again take to the streets in demonstrations against both Israel and the United States.
Something like 1984 could actually happen. This is the direction the world is going in at the present time.
자기들이 피해복구 전 임무를 완수하고도 사랑하는 집이 있는 평양행을 택하지 않고 스스로들 또 다른 피해복구 지역으로 발걸음들을 옮긴 애국자들, 마땅히 이 자리에 있어야 할 우리의 핵심들, 나의 가장 믿음직한 수도당원 사단 전투원들에게도 전투적 공호와 감사의 인사를 보냅니다.
Приветствуем шаги руководства КНДР, направленные на налаживание прямого диалога с Соединенными Штатами Америки.
불가결하다는 것을 깊이 인식하고 있으며 저로 친선 관계를 보다 새로운 높은 단계에 올려세울 의지에 충만되어 있습니다.
China's parliament, the National People's Congress, has just approved a constitutional amendment to abolish presidential term limits.
One thing I've learned, President Xi of China, he's 100%. Putin of Russia, 100%. Kim Jong-un, by the way, whatever happened to that war we were supposed to be in? Kim Jong-un of North Korea, 100%. These people are sharp and they're smart.
Has broken his silence on the US presidential election. Russian president spoke about the US election in a way which left the viewers confused. Putin said that a sharp anti-Russia rhetoric was noted in Joe Biden's comments. The Democratic candidate Joe Biden has been critical of Russia throughout his campaign, expressing his displeasure. Putin said that Russia has grown used to Biden's anti-Russia stand.
And as for the democratic recession, of course there is a connection between human rights and democracy. Actually, democracy is associated with limitation of power, with respect for fundamental rights or for human rights. People's loss of confidence in democracy. Most surveys demonstrate in the United States, in Europe, in Brazil, that young generations don't care for democracy as much as the past generations. There are many reasons, I think, for that. there are political reasons. The representative systems, the political systems, do not give voice and relevance to citizenship. One of the mottos of the criticism of modern democracies is they don't represent us. The second factor that I think brings some discredit to democracy is inequality. But most authors will agree that quality education, efficient public services, and inclusive political and economic institutions are issues or factors that can contribute to the fight against inequality. And a third factor I would include there is corruption. In many parts of the world, corruption of public officers is still a major problem. The private appropriation of the state, the embezzlement of public funds, and the set of wrong decisions that you take because of bribery and other problems. I have this rational faith that I'm going to share with you. It's that history is a flux, is a permanent march towards the good, towards civilization advancement. So I'm very convinced that we are building a better world.
The American people, no matter what their political view, must make it clear that American democracy will not be destroyed. Our country, from its inception and through the sacrifices of millions, has been a model to the world with regard to representative government. In 1863, in the midst of the terrible Civil War, Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg stated that this government, quote, of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That was true then, that is true today. Regardless of what Donald Trump wants, the American people will preserve democracy. Thank you all very much.